Okay. Hello, my name is Silvan. I'm working for Leap, as most of you know. I'm going to show you a brief introduction about the Zend Framework. I mean, after all, it's a huge framework, so we take specific looks at the MVC part of it, and the example I show you at the end will introduce some more components that are included as well. So Zend Framework has received a lot of buzz recently, and the website reads very flowery words about what this actually is. And on one hand, it is a library. I mean, there are loose components that are standing for itself, and on the other hand, it is a framework, as you know it from other frameworks like Ruby on Rails, like Okapi, like Symfony, and these kind of frameworks. And yeah, I mean, the actual goal, or the stated goal of the Zend Framework is actually to provide a library with loosely coupled components to simplify and to enhance web development and do web development in a clean and proper way as kind of contemporary. I like the word contemporary because PHP has gone a long way, and we have seen a lot of attempts to improve the way things are done, and Zend really tries to just take this experience and put it into their framework. Yeah, what they are also proud of is that it's very well tested. Some time ago I read that on 140,000 lines of code there are about 80,000 lines of test code written for each component, which is impressive in that sense, and most of the stuff really works out of the box from my experience. Zend Framework actually exists since 2005, which I didn't know. I mean, in 2005 I didn't heard about the framework, or there was a little buzz about it, and most of people thought, oh yeah, now Zend is coming up with another framework, and nobody, at least myself, and we weren't that convinced that this will gonna take off or that this will gonna lead somewhere. And suddenly it was here. Suddenly they released version 1.0 and came up with this huge bunch of stuff that was already there, and yeah, it seemed pretty serious. So what is also to mention is that, or what I personally also like, is that the way they throw buzzwords all around, and they state that it's corporate friendly license. Most of the stuff is BSD license, and if you are a developer you have to sign some contribution agreement that what you're contributing is can be put under the BSD license as well. And all their statements about and all their buzzwords, I mean, it's kind of, okay, we are here, use this framework, use it in corporate context, make money with it, we don't care. I mean, I like the way they put it straight, and it's not like, oh yeah, we are this open source framework and you can maybe use it in your corporate application. So they don't have this attitude at all, and I mean that's a sympathetic aspect of the whole thing. If you want to get, currently they're on the release 1.02, which was a minor update recently, and to keep track of what is going on in the whole universe of the Zend Framework, you can check on these weekly summaries, which are quite useful, where they summarize the development of overall components and core components, contributions, and whatnot. So what is actually in the Zend Framework? The Zend Framework mainly consists of core components, which stand for themselves, which also can be used for themselves, and the most important ones probably are listed in the gray in the gray boxes on the left. And then there is the MVC, the actual request handling, the framework component, so-called, which consists of the MVC parts for a controller. They have routing, they have a view. Then they have data handling components for doing database access. That database, it's an abstraction. They also have pretty good active record implementations. They have this quite famous Zend Search Lucene, completely implemented in PHP. They have PDF library, and on top of that, they implemented a lot of web services or interfaces to web services, and they have components for translation, for internationalization, And there is, for instance, just a class to deal with dates or to deal with currency conversion or measurement conversions and stuff like that. And there is also to say that in the whole development process, it is required, or it's kind of they look for dependencies within the framework, and without reinventing the wheel, without using code. So they have a pretty strict rule that if somebody is implementing a component, for instance, I followed the OpenID component recently. So if this guy is implementing that component, the community and the core developers are keeping track that this guy is really using other components for doing tasks within his own world. Say, for instance, to dealing with cryptography, you don't write your own cryptography algorithms, you use the Zend crypt package and stuff like that. Which is also to say that first I had the impression, okay, they're just going to build another peer, which isn't the case in that sense, because you don't have to extend from one huge peer.php master class, and it is not a monolithic in that sense. I mean, you can couple new components as long as you follow some guidelines and rules, but you're not bound to any other structures. And also you can check out they have yet no install system or dependency checker system that like you know it from peer. So the development cycle of the Zend frameworks usually is that a developer comes and proposes something to the community. Then he gets access to the wiki and posts that stuff. Then he gets reviews and feedback from both sides, from the community and the core team, whether this idea is a good one or whether he should better leave it. And if he already contributed code or committed code, this code gets also reviewed and gets proof. And then there are two ways. On one way, if the proposal is that good that it can go directly into what they call incubator, which is kind of an intermediate state before package receives or gets into the core, then the way is pretty straight. If that's not the case, if there are improvements to do or if there are code issues to fix, it gets to sort of a laboratory stage. And in the laboratory, it stays as long in the laboratory as long as there are issues to fix, and it gets the whole cycle continues continues with reviews, with comments, with improvements, with re-releases, and maybe a component never makes it into incubator or into the core, and others like again this OpenID component, it was very well done from the very beginning, so it directly went to the incubator and just had minor improvements, which Dimitri, who is writing it now, has to fix. Yeah. So, and basically everybody can contribute as long as you sign this license agreement, which you have to either send by post or print out the PDF, sign it, and scan it again, at least with 3000 pixels resolution, and send it again back to them. So, yeah. But then you get an account and you can commit stuff. Now let's have a look at the MVC part of the Zend framework, which is actually kind of the heart. I mean, as stated before, you can use the Zend framework loosely coupled from any point. You just can include what you need, but actually you can also do the whole request handling, and you can build your whole application on top of the Zend framework's MVC. So these are the parts that are involved in the whole request handling, which are quite some objects, as you can imagine as you know from MVC. I mean, basically there is a front controller that receives the request, that creates request and response objects, and these request and response objects that you see on the right side are going to pass through the whole process. So like every part in between is just manipulating on this request and response objects, or putting in data into that request, receiving data from that request until it gets finally dispatched from the response. The parts in between are basically a router and a controller and a view. These three components are kind of the central places where you as a developer also kind of interfere, or where you actually do your work. And yeah, just briefly describe that the router is doing request routing, as we see later on how the requests are mapped within the framework. Then the controller is kind of the model that's doing the logic, and finally the view is responsible for transformation and yeah, for transforming the data from the model. The URL mapping is pretty simple. Basically, the first part of the base URL translates to the controller, where the second part translates to the action within the controller. And there is an additional option that you can use modules, where you can group certain tasks within your application. The first part where a request ends up is your routing controller. Actually, that what we saw on the screen before is actually done by the default router. This translation of the request URL to the actual controller and action part. But you can of course implement what you like, and you can also do, say, I have a test application that listens to /tag /something. I can tell my router to actually route everything to my tag index controller, which is defined here, and everything that's underneath tag, strip this action, strip this ID, and make this available to the controller later. This is a basic task that a router can do. There are options for doing static routing. Say if you have your on /login, you always have to log in, then you can use a static router that does no further translation or manipulation of the request URI. Or you can also do advanced things with a regex router where you can implement your regexes to match certain patterns and then decide upon that what to do. The controller then receives this, is the next step actually, and the most important part of the controller is actually the action. There is some naming convention how to define your methods within there, but then you're basically free to do whatever you need. And this example actually now does nothing else than creating a DOM document, loading some XML, and passes the data to the view. What is special, these init methods and these init view methods here, we see in the next step that these are used to create my own view, but that comes later on. First, another thing to the controller. Actually, the requests within the controller or within the dispatcher are handled in a loop, meaning that you can chain controllers. You can have as many controllers as you like, and you can use this forward or redirect methods within the controller to actually go to other parts in your application. And the main dispatcher loops as long as your request finally gets ready for dispatching, and then executes the view and everything, which has advantages and disadvantages, but it can be useful. Say there was this case recently, what I do, I have a standard exception screen. So what I do from my controller if I have to go to my standard exception screen, so just forward it to your exception controller and then do the rest from there. Stuff like that can be easily achieved like that. The difference between the forward and the redirect actually does a real redirect, I mean a header redirect finally, and the forward is just an application redirect. It just goes into the next iteration of the loop. Finally, the view, and here's to say that the default view handling in Zend, in the Zend MVC chain is kind of ugly. I have to admit that. And what is happening by default is that there are these helpers, as you can guess from the class name, this Zend controller action helper view renderer. Is an action helper view renderer that gets initialized by default, and that basically does this include function get argument 0, where he retrieves a view script that can be anything, PHP or whatever is executable, and then this script is responsible to actually do the templating, do this thing. So this is admittedly ugly, and this is not the way actually, most of us probably don't want that. But you can easily circumvent that and create your own view. Just tell the controller to disable this view render with this no view render option, and then it's up on you to create your own view. The view basically needs a render function, and within this render function, again, you can do pretty much what you want. In my Zend view XSLT, I just received the XSL name from my XSL template, later on does the whole XSLT processing, and then return just the content from my transformation. I hereby take advantage of what I received previously here, where this view data got set from the controller, and I'm just gonna use that data and transform it in my view. And that's also, like, the whole view mechanism can be overridden by the controller itself. And that's why this init view and this init methods I had to override at this point, or within the controller. When the controller is actually called, or when the controller is being created or instantiated, I already start preparing my view components and override the default view that this view render helper stuff with my view that I initialize in this init view method later. The controller also has a render function and does nothing else than actually triggers the view to render the script, receive the transformed data, and append it to the response. So this is actually the point where I tell the response what will be my output, or what will be my output. The response object itself knows nothing except is able to send the correct headers to prepare the whole stuff which is necessary to deliver the data, and then just dumps that. There's nothing more to it. There are a few other goodies within this process. There are so-called action helpers. You can hook in the pre-dispatch and post-dispatch point, and you can also use the helpers directly from the controllers, which is useful if you have to kind of append some footer continuously, or if you have to kind of fetch some data from external at every request, or read some cache, do some cache checks at every request, whatnot. And then there are plugins. The plugins are intended to be used, actually to actually hook into various points of the controller dispatching. And there you see at all these points you can actually register a plugin and to define a callback where it gets called, and then you can interfere with both, actually, with the controller, or with the view, or with the request itself. That's up on you. I mean, it's a process which, personally, I have never used plugins yet. I have never seen a reason, because I have very flexible controllers, so plugins never were necessary until now. Okay, now let's look at some example. I always have the thing that sometimes I want to have some blog posts which we are using from the eToy blog. I always need them if I'm somewhere and I'm offline. I don't have this information, so I have to hook up my phone and everything. So I thought it's a good opinion to turn this into a little demo, because I want to read my blogs offline, and there are nice components to actually achieve that. So we're going to use these components. We're going to use Zend config. We're going to use the Zend DB abstraction. We're going to use Zend DB select query creator. We're going to use Zend search Lucene to actually create an index of the blog post. We're going to use Zend cache to cache the contents of the blog post. And we're going to use Zend HTTP client to receive the image and create a local copy of them. And for the front end, I'm using Zend MVC to display something of this search. I'm using the Zend search Lucene front end, and again I'm using the Zend cache for reading the blog post. And this is how it's gonna work, how it should work. There is an index replication that actually receives the blog post from the database directly, and then creates a Lucene index locally, puts in all data I need, creates a cache file from the block content, because I'm not going to put the block contents in the index itself, because the index would blow and it's never used anyway. And I'm gonna cache the images because I want to see something offline. We are using a lot of images. And finally, all of this should be accessible from a neat front end that I can use as an application on my machine.
Suggest something.
Yeah.
Control-Shift-R and then start typing the file name.
No, it doesn't work. This project is open. Okay, I mean, we do a brief run through that. I'm not going to explain every detail. I'm just briefly explaining where which component got used. This is the indexer part that actually does the fetching and the index creation, which consists of some configuration options above that basically say what is the database connection.
Is that a live database?
That is a test database on my local host. Then you see, then we have some information about where I want to store my local caches, my indexes. Then I'm instantiating the config object that create the database adapter, and then basically just do the query, fetch the blocks, and then use this Zend select API to create the queries, which is kind of nice in the sense that I can just join. I mean, I just can do kind of object concatenation of commands, which finally builds my query, and include all joins, all where, all group statements within that concatenation. Then I'm creating different kinds of fields for my search index, and that's a nice feature of the Zend search Lucene anyway. You can basically store text, of course, and then you can have the option to store to actually do an unstored field, which means that the content gets tokenized and indexed, but not the whole content is stored, which is particularly useful, for instance, for my blog post. So I'm just going to tokenize and index the words, but the post on itself I'm going to just cache externally for just comfortability to have it available and to read it afterwards. And then you can have also the opinion to add unindexed field, which basically just needs to find your data afterwards, like the post ID or the URI, which say nothing about the post itself, but are useful to retrieve the data from it later.
Just a question: are the index it produces like compatible with the Java?
They say I have never done that transaction or that transition from either of the two, but they say Okay, I'm going to store all my blog posts in the index, and I'm caching. I'm using the simple Zend file cache. I'm going to cache the blog posts in a simple file locally. Then I'm doing some magic with the images. I mean, it's not that magic at all. I just fetch them and rewrite the image path that I have them, that the image URL matches, that I can look up them locally. So that's all there is. And this I can run periodically on my machine to get the updates and to get the most recent version. And on the server side, I basically had to implement a query action in my controller. I've created a blog controller that handles all blog, this offline blog related things. One action for the query and one action to represent the detail view. And within these methods, I'm making use of the Zend search Lucene components as well as of the caching components again to retrieve the data. And what it finally all looks like is I have a tiny, neat application that gives me some data about our blog, which I can read offline anywhere available. And what is also, the nice part, this stuff was written in 3 hours. And it was really kind of a no-brainer using a lot of components. I knew all the components involved, otherwise I wouldn't have known that they match and they can use them. But once you have this clue about which component is useful and how actually to handle them, you're pretty fast. And I like this aspect on that sense because you often have to defend this time argument against some Ruby guys as in, I create this form in 30 minutes and stuff like that. And I kind of looked at the watch to see how long it actually takes to create something like this, and it was pretty easy in that sense. So yeah.
How many hours have you spent with this framework?
Yet?
In total, how long have you been working with it?
Well, I don't know.
Roughly,
I'm really using it now since 3 months, basically, on an almost daily basis. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, any other questions?
So we basically developed our own framework for local and some other projects, which is open source since months, by the way. And you are using now Zend Framework for Schweizer Fernsehen.
Yes.
So what's your experience with a framework which should solve a lot of problems compared to a framework which is built for solving exactly one problem we had at local, for example? So what, in terms of performance, for example, or would you use Zend Framework for local today?
Probably not. Oh, probably it depends. The thing is really there is a lot of overhead in skimming through the thing. There is a big difference if you're using a framework that you have written from scratch and that you know in every detail, and then you get confronted with that framework which is admittedly very large. There are tons of classes and tons of abstractions and tons of patterns and whatnot, and you have to get a clue of this before you actually get comfortable with. But I find actually then it becomes really comfortable. Then it becomes also I have now a pretty clean imagination what was very confusing at the beginning, I think, is now quite clean. But I don't know whether I would. There is no reason why I would say you should build local CH on Zend Framework today. Then you should build it on the Okapi framework.
Okay. Can you tell us, I don't know if this is all protected in secret or such, but can you tell us a few words about the real world stuff you're doing with the framework?
Yeah, I mean, currently we're using the Zend Framework basically in its components, as well as the MVC, and we're using it as a component library in conjunction with another framework, and we're using it as an MVC framework for certain parts, and the most obvious example at the moment is OpenID.sf.tv, which is built on Zend OpenID, yeah? On that server. That's the most visible part at the moment, and the other part is kind of a rewrite of an internal rewrite of some content management parts that we are doing actually, which are not so obviously visible because they're kind of mixed with the rest.
Okay.
Are there any of the real world Zend framework examples you can use?
Any real world Zend framework examples, see on framework.zend.com. There's a listing on the most famous one. I don't know of the most famous one, but yeah.
In a few weeks or months, we will see a real-world example of the Zend framework on Tilate. Leo and Martens are developing, reprogramming Tilate based on the Zend framework. Yeah.
Years.
Really, Mark?
I don't think so.
It looks
I think
very confident.
I think the most, probably the biggest example is IBM using it for their wiki.
Yeah.
The QED wiki.
Yeah, I guess so. So they're making lots of noise about that, but
No,
yeah.
but for instance,
But
I
that's all,
also
I
find a
guess.
strong
Just
argument
noise.
for using it in this context is
concept.
like you have a common language for this stuff. I mean, if you have one framework that maybe uses a pattern internally or that maybe does something but then does it consequently and does its own functions method mix, and then you don't know how to talk about these things except going to these people and maybe, oh, I found this very difficult, and then with the Zend framework you have a kind of a common language to talk about these things. I mean, if somebody's joining the team and I tell him, oh, we're using ZendDB. Oh, what is ZendDB? Yeah, it is a ZendDB abstraction layer, but it also includes active record pattern, and it includes table row gateway pattern. Maybe this guy can make sense of it. I mean, maybe he's coming from the Ruby world, but has heard active record, and it's much easier to find kind of consent. I mean, then you can fight about which implementation is actually nicer or which implementation offers more. But that's a point I found convincing about this whole thing. They're not trying to kind of do cryptological things within their framework. They try to keep transparent and using kind of a common language, common terms, common patterns, and that's I found an advantage to work with.
yeah. That's the speed of coding side of things. The speed of code.
Speed of understanding.
Yeah, and what about, is it fast? I mean, not as programming, but as a program.
Yeah, I want to benchmark Okapi versus Zend Framework in a simple Hello World example, and the benchmarks are pretty much, Okapi was faster to some extent, but if you looked at the call stack and what objects get instantiated on the way, Zend Framework obviously was pretty much, was comparatively bloated. There are a lot of objects. There's a view, there is a dispatcher, there is a dispatcher abstract, there is a, you know.
For absolute numbers.
Absolute numbers, no.
Milliseconds.
No. No, but that's, I mean, that's, you know.
Depends on the number of pages
In
you
what
get.
way are milliseconds absolute?
Yeah.
So on
Maybe
the,
quick.
No, but
Very absolute. Yeah, we have the same machine, always, yes, then it is.
Not even then.
Not even then. I mean, depends.
The MVC part takes about 30 includes to set itself up, but it performs pretty well still.
Yeah, it does. What is there are, I mean, if you look into the code, you see some things that make you think. Like they do a lot of includes, and they, for instance, have this auto loader class. They have Zend loader, which does the auto loading job. And if you don't use Zend loader, they do it via includes. But if you use the loader, they still, I mean, the includes are not vanished, they're still there. So there are some things that make me think, or that are not pretty clear to me, or that I think are kind of hidden compromises to actually achieve the flexibility, or I don't know.
I guess that's the ultimate question. Like, do you, when now you've worked with it 3 months, are the things that you think suck about it so painful that you wouldn't use it again? Or
No, not again.
For me, there are.
What is a sucky? What is the most sucky point of?
I think it's for a PHP framework. It's just over-designed.
No, but that's cool. That's
no, this whole MVC part. I worked in school with Java frameworks, and I always thought, why the hell they do this complicated? And then I run into Zend Framework, and for us it's pretty cool because we build a big site, and it makes sense at some points. But actually it's a pain to go through all these patterns and includes and thousands of files, and it's really a pain.
If you want a real example, for example, they have the way how they build the URLs, and how you can pass named arguments over the URLs. And if you want to change that, you can't just subclass, or do you? I don't know. You can't just change some parameter somewhere, but you have to subclass a lot of stuff just to change.
Just
to change that.
Yeah, but that's the way it works. I mean, you have to subclass another class, so what?
Yeah, but there's still a lot of stuff is hardwired, so you start subclassing, and then it never ends, because then you have hardwired classes you have to fix somehow, so you have to subclass again, and so on.
I mean, that was maybe the point where it gets stressful, because it's not about subclassing. So what, that would be the easy part, but you have to read all the parent classes, and you have to read through all the properties, and that's the exhausting part of it, maybe.
It's very over-designed, and then you cannot modify everything. You still have to subclass, and that's where it gets ugly, because I think in the last 3-4 months I subclassed nearly everything. I think there's not one class I'm not
I was in Frankfurt for the PHP conference, and they had like discussion with Zend Framework, Easy Components, Symfony, and some guy that has been using everything. And one of the they were asked for a definition of a framework, and one of the definitions given was that a framework is a coding environment that does not easily let you break out of. So the idea is that it does define a coding style, and if you're not okay with that coding style, you're not going to get happy with a specific framework.
So that pretty much matches to Zend Framework as well, I think.
Yeah. And because if you can break out, then you lose the common language sort of an application. So the idea is that not only you can talk about it, but every application written with that framework sort of feels similar.
But it's very easy to only use parts of it and then grow into it eventually. I started with the database class, and then ended up with using the MVC and config and everything. It's well documented.
Let's do. Should we do? I'm going to cut it short now, because I think. Should we do a quick timeout if you want to grab beer or queue for the toilet?